everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Alicia Gavidan, and I am an adult services librarian with Vaughan Public Libraries. Before we start the formal program, I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. To minimize interruptions, participants will be set to mute and all videos will be turned off. For accessibility, we have turned on the live transcript feature. A question and answer period will follow the lecture. Questions can be sent in at any time during the lecture via the chat function and are moderated by the co-hosts. Tonight's lecture is being recorded and will be made available on VPL's YouTube channel. On behalf of Vaughan Public Libraries, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that our libraries were built upon the territory and the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation per the Toronto Purchase Agreement, or Treaty 13. We also recognize we are situated in the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee, who occupied this land before the arrival of European settlers. The city of Vaughan is currently home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge their contributions to the life and prosperity of this land. As representatives of the people of the city of Vaughan, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live in this territory. This evening, I'm pleased to welcome Grusha Agarwal, PhD student in the Organizational Behavior and Human Resource Management Department at Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome. I'm handing it over to you, Grusha. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alicia. And thank you everyone for being here. This is absolutely a privilege and honor. And as I was telling Alicia before, libraries have a very special place in my heart. So I'm very happy to be here. Okay, let's do this. Sharing my screen. Okay, I'm hoping people can see everything. Okay, so hi everyone. Today I'm gonna talk a little bit about racial group labels. So a little bit about me first, oh, no. Okay, so like Alicia said, I'm a PhD candidate. I'm a fourth year in the Organizational Behavior Department at the Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto. So I'm interested in studying the behavioral approaches to diversity. I look at interventions that increase diversity or reduce inequality at workplaces. And I specifically focus on systemic barriers, systemic things that are perpetuating discrimination and inequality at workplaces. So one of the things that I was really interested in are these racial group labels. But before I go very much into it, I just want you all to take a second and think about what would you answer if I asked you this question? What is your race? So just take a second and think about it. And not to anyone's surprise, people probably answer this in very different ways. So some people prefer like a broad umbrella label, like Asian or Black. Some people go by the skin, the color of their skin. Some people want to be very specific, like Indian or Polish. And despite the wide variety of ways that this question can be answered, and sometimes the discomfort that people experience when they're answering this question, we're actually asked to think about and report our race quite a bit in our lives. So we can be asked to think about our race or report our race in workplace disclosure forms when we're asked to do an equity census, on a consumer preference survey, when we actually do a national census, when we're talking interpersonally with our friends, with our family, and information that can be used to categorize us by race is being fed into algorithms all the time to determine anything from the type of ads we see to the type of home loans that we would get. In our work, I got particularly interested in these employee census forms. So these forms that organizations yearly have to ask, it is often mandated, it is mandated in Canada and in the US, where organizations which have greater than 100 employees have to ask their employees to fill out this demographic form that asks their race, their gender, and all of these different things. So this is an example of what it would look like. So this is what it looks like in the US. Are you Hispanic or Latino? And then it asks the question, what is your race? Select one of the following categories: white, Black, and African American, American Indian, Asian, etc., etc. This is another example. It was so big, I couldn't fit it in to one page, but I tried my best. But this is a Canadian institution, particularly University of Toronto, asks a race question like this. So as you can see, there's a lot of variation. Some people only have like 4 or 5 generic terms. Some people go into a lot of different details. But the general gist is this is something that all organizations, including corporations and universities, are asking their employees and students to report quite often. So what I'm really interested in is this tension between organizational and individual needs. So it seems seemingly neutral that organizations just need to collect this data. And their intentions are good because they want to use these forms for compliance, for workforce planning, for meeting their diversity goals. So organizations their goal is to collect this data so they can really make sure if they're like on track to meet their goals, to really kind of introspect the kind of demographic population of their organization so they can do better, ideally. Or individuals, on the other hand, who are filling out these forms, they really need to be able to disclose their racial identity, which is very sensitive and often stigmatized for a lot of individuals, using their preferred labels, and they sometimes may not even want to disclose at all. So this is this tension that I will be exploring in my work. And again, I want to emphasize that this is often taken as a neutral and straightforward process, that this is a check the mark box, you select a race and you move on. What I'm arguing and what I show in my data is that racial identity can actually be non-neutral for racial minorities, especially because it can be non-singular. So for example, we know multiracial people, they need to be able to identify with different races at once. Racial identity can actually often be fluid. A lot of research has shown that people, based on where they're living, based on their socioeconomic status, they are fluid in the type of identity they apply to themselves. This is all true for multiracial individuals who can switch between races, but also for monoracial individuals. Some people, research has shown that people, even being monoracial, they switch between races depending on different contexts. Racial identity can often be uncertain. People may not always know what categories apply to them. So before I moved to Canada, I was living in the US, and there the category that was applied was Asian. But before that, I was living in India, and I didn't really know what Asian meant, because colloquially, when people said Asian, they meant East Asian. So I really wasn't certain what is my racial identity, what should I be ticking on this box. So racial identity can actually be uncertain for a lot of people. And lastly, racial identity can be acategorical. So we shouldn't always assume that it's compulsory to have an identity that people want to disclose. People may not think of race as a category that is important to their identity and may not want to disclose it at all. They may not want to identify with the category at all. So thinking of all of these things, we see that racial minorities are susceptible to what we call categorization threat. So categorization threat is this experience that arises when individuals actually face a discrepancy, a dissonance between their own identity and the way that they're categorized by others. So when individuals, especially racial minorities, who are more susceptible to having non-singular, fluid, uncertain, acategorical identities than majority groups, when they are asked to fill out these forms, they may experience, when they encounter labels that they may not identify with, that they're unsure if it applies to them, they may feel this categorization threat, that they're being forced to fit into a category that they don't necessarily belong to. This can also frustrate their needs for identity autonomy and identity legitimacy. What I mean by these is identity autonomy. I am free to be who I am. I'm in control of how I identify myself. So when we don't give individuals the freedom to check multiple boxes in a disclosure form. Multiracial people may not feel like they're free to be who they are, that they're in control of their identities, and they have to pick and choose parts of their identities to just fill out this form. Identity legitimacy means how I define myself is recognized and accepted by others. So maybe I am free to write it, but do I feel like others are respectful, are accepting of my identities? Maybe I don't. If the label that I use is not there in the form and some label for majority groups are there, I may feel like my identities are not as valued as theirs. So these two competing roles play an important part in racial minorities disclosure. So by conceptualizing racial identity as basically singular, stable, easily definable, and compulsory, racial disclosure itself as neutral and straightforward. These are assumptions traditionally that we make when we more or less when we're designing these disclosure forms, and when we're talking about race usually in these forms. Organizations may actually be collecting this disclosure data in a way that's actually threatening their identity autonomy and identity legitimacy. So I really focus on these identity-based processes that may be threatened as a result of the assumptions that we make with these when we're designing the disclosure processes. Okay, and just to really write this point home, I wanted to show you that racial minorities may be even more restricted when it comes to this restriction of identity autonomy and identity legitimacy. So for example, a multiracial people, when they have to pick one race, sometimes immigrants, when they come to a new country, they want to identify themselves as a mix of their own ethnicity and the new country that they're coming to. So they may want to, for example, identify as Chinese Canadian versus Chinese. Or people may want to be more specific when they identify versus Asian. So for example, most US forms don't have the option to identify as Indian. Canadian forms do, but so that is a discrepancy that I'm talking about here. So there are all of these ways that racial minorities are even more vulnerable to experiencing this categorization threat, this lack of identity autonomy and legitimacy while they're filling out these disclosure forms. So what do we actually see in our data? So here are the research questions that I'll just quickly go over. But basically, overall, I was interested in how do employees, because we focused on this workplace disclosure form setting, how do employees feel about and manage disclosing their racial identities in professional contexts? And does this experience differ for employees who identify as white versus those who identified with historically devalued racial groups like which I'm going to call non-white, just to make the stark comparison between what I see for non-white groups versus white groups. Okay, so study one was just to explore this context of workplace disclosure. So to really understand, is there something going on? Are the intuitions correct? Are the theory that we're basing on is actually showing up at the workplace? So I was really interested to begin with, to really see what are people's preferences, feelings, perceptions, recommendations, some focus, some broader racial labels. So when I say broader, it means something like people of color, racialized that we use in Canadian context, and focus like Asian, Black, etc., that are used to describe these members of racial minority groups. So we did an exploratory survey because we just wanted to see what's going on at these workplaces, and we had employed respondents, and we did 2 nationally representative samples from US and Canada. What nationally representative here would mean is just we really made sure that the age demographic and everything really matches up what you would see on a population scale, just scaled down to however the number of participants we had. So this was to make sure that if in a country there are 100 people and 60 of them are white and 20 of them are Black and so on, that reflects in our data as well, so we can see. So these are however many number of people we had. We gender balanced men and women. So we really wanted to make sure we had an equal number of men and women in our sample, but we did oversample non-white participants. So we had like a majority of non-white people because we really wanted to understand their experiences. So there were 3 survey themes that we explored. So self-identification, what do individuals really identify with? So what are the labels that are out there, and are people even identifying with them? Second was, how do people feel about these labels? And the third was around really understanding what do they recommend going forward. So what we see for self-identification is basically my favorite part of the study. But before I go into that, I just wanted to orient you to what you're going to see. So this is a statement that they saw. I identified with this term. The non-white respondents only here means that the graph that I'm going to show you is just non-white respondents, because we wanted to see if non-white respondents identify with non-white labels. So it wouldn't make sense to have white participants in this analysis particularly. And so orienting you to the graph before I show you a very overwhelming graph, the y-axis is the number of non-white respondents who said that they identify with the term. The x-axis shows the different labels. So these are the labels I showed to them. And here you'll see most or all of these labels are broad, because as a conservative test, we wanted to see if these labels which refer to these groups in the aggregate, which encompass so many different types of racial groups, like how many and non-white participants actually end up identifying with them. Okay, so let's get into it. So these are the number of people who said they don't identify with any of these labels. So they're not a member. So a big proportion of these people, they said they weren't a member of any of these groups. These proportion of people said they do not identify with these labels despite others categorizing them as such. And these many people said they only slightly identify despite others categorizing them as such. Here is the interesting thing, and here I want to draw this 50% line, just to show you that 50% or more than 50% of non-white people who are supposed to technically be in this label, they are within the umbrella of these labels, say they either do not identify or only very slightly identify with any of these labels. And this includes people of color, racialized, which is very popular in Canada, visible minorities, as you can see. People really don't seem to like racialized. And this is just to show you the rest of the graph, and to really just iterate that people really had this dissonance when it came to really identifying with any of these labels. It seems like they liked people of color the most, but it's still not ideal. The other thing I want to show you is I asked them, how confident are you about using the correct labels to refer to people of your own race or other races? So this was really to get at, there are labels out there, everyone knows about them, but how confident are you that you're using the correct labels? And this is what we see. And this is basically what I want you to focus on is, I've split the results by US and Canada in case you were curious, but in both countries, non-white participants were much more likely to say than white participants that they're confident about using the correct labels for the other race. When it comes to their own race, everyone was similarly confident. This can be especially stigmatizing because non-white participants who are already stigmatized at the workplace, if they're mislabeled by majority groups, that can add to the additional stigma that they already experience at the workplace. So white participants having much less confidence to actually that they're using the correct labels for minority individuals can be very problematic. Next, we wanted to see if they thought that these labels are associated with negative stereotypes. So again, here are all the labels that they see. Just to show you, this line is the mean. So what this really means that all of these labels are seen as negatively stereotyped by both white and non-white participants. So even though we are using these labels, people are aware of these labels, there's a consensus there. Even with people of color, which people seem to identify with the most, they do think that it's negatively stereotyped. When it comes to recommendations, we really wanted to know that if they thought these labels should change. So this is the statement they saw. I think that some of these terms used for different races in the census or at my workplace should be revised or changed. And I'll show you the results by country and also split by whether they thought the label should change in the census or workplace or both. So here's what we see. And again, here's what I want you to focus on. That in all of these, non-white individuals are significantly more likely to advocate for a label change. So there's something in the status quo that needs to change. So white people are less confident about using these labels, but they are in consensus that they are negatively stereotyped. And actually, non-white participants were more likely to say they're negatively stereotyped. Non-white individuals are also more likely to say that these labels need to change. They advocate for a label change more at the census level, but they also want a change at the organizational level. And this is all, as you can see, greater than the 3.5 mean mark. So there's something that needs to change. So key takeaways, because I showed you so many graphs, what does it mean? And what is it that I want you to take home from this? About 50% of the population that these labels actually aim to include either do not identify or only very slightly identify with these labels. Non-white individuals perceive the labels as more negatively stereotyped, and they also think that these labels need to change, and this is much more than what white individuals believe. White individuals also feel less confident about using these umbrella labels for minorities. And this is crucial, like I said, because this mislabeling can create this additional stigma and feeling of exclusion among members of already marginalized groups. So these labels matter, and disclosure forms, which are often imposed and mandated, may not be as neutral as we think. So having established disclosure as like a context where this dissonance for non-white individuals might happen, we wanted to dig deeper, and we wanted to move away from the umbrella labels and use the actual labels that individuals see and really understand this experience of workplace disclosure. And that's what study 2 was really about. And since we didn't know what exactly to expect and how people are navigating this process, we really went with a qualitative study. So we wanted to see how do people feel and what strategies are they using when they experience this dissonance when they're asked to disclose their race. So what we did was we did a qualitative survey with employed people, and we had them write in open text responses on Prolific. So we had about 180 people from US, UK, and Canada. And we, again, gender balance the sample, and we oversample non-white participants to really make sure that we have enough sample size to determine the experiences of non-white participants. Not to get into too many details, but qualitative content analyses is how we inductively and iteratively coded the responses that we got on Prolific to understand what is actually going on at the workplace. So overall trends, so about 80% of the people recall disclosing race during the recruitment process. So when we asked them to reflect on their disclosure experience, most of them recalled the recruitment process. About 60% of them said that if they were given like no boundaries in their ideal world, they would choose to identify their race using a nationality-based label, so Canadian, British, Turkish. There was consensus between white and non-white participants in our sample on that the importance of this disclosure process. So they all agreed that workplace disclosure is important because people need to do it for diversity tracking, for equal employment opportunities, so organizations are held accountable. It's probably just not done right. There's not enough research that's gone into it. There's not due diligence that's done on the organization's part. Okay, so these are the three main themes that came out of my research. So one was around how employees, how individuals feel about disclosure. The second was around the strategies that they use when they experience that dissonance between how they wanted to self-identify versus the options and the way in which those options were presented to them. So that categorization threat, that limitation of identity, autonomy, and legitimacy that we talked about. And the third was around the recommendations for organizations. So these are the detailed codes, and we're going to talk about them one by one. So let's get into it. So for non-white individuals, how they felt about disclosure was really about feeling excluded and alienated. So here are some examples. So this person talks about how they often found that their race was not included in the list of options provided, and when it was listed in parentheses next to Caucasian, when they don't necessarily identify as such. So this non-inclusion often left them feeling like an outlier, and that the surveys were not necessarily geared towards them or towards people from their same racial background. So this feeling of exclusion is a theme that kept coming again and again when it came to non-white individuals. Another theme that came up was around alienation, because they were forced to be grouped in a category that was too broad, that they don't feel like they belong with. Their histories weren't the same, their culture wasn't the same. So this person talks about how they feel the term Asian is often used, but it's so broad. And people often assume the word Asian is only for East Asians, so Chinese, Japanese, etc. And it feels like it excludes South Asians, although many would identify with this term. Some more examples from non-white individuals. So people from multiple ethnic backgrounds tend to already feel alienated from their backgrounds and thus feel the need to choose a single ethnicity to adopt. So this person talked about how they would just have to suck it up and choose the closest option, because what they wanted to ideally choose was not available to them. Another example, this person talks about how they did not feel represented by these labels, as they don't identify with any of the racial labels except the label other. So a lot of these forms have these labels that they list, and then they would have an other label and an open text response. So a lot of our non-white individuals said that they ended up choosing the label other. So it's not specific enough for them, but it's the only option that encompassed all those that are not included. So when they're not included, they use other. And if they had the option with the other to type in their answer, they would do that. But if not, they would choose other, than like forcing themselves into a category that they didn't belong to. When it came to white individuals, they actually reported feeling either neutral or not affected, or they thought labeling was unnecessary altogether. So what we saw was statements like these: the experience to me is simply a meaningless box ticking exercise. It is not important to me in any way. I do not know why I was asked to disclose it, as I feel that is not significant to any job really. The experience was fine, but it did make me wonder why it's necessary to make it known your race on an application form. So really basically just doubting the whole process, feeling like it's not necessary, it's not a good use of time, some people said. But they didn't really feel the dissonance. They didn't really feel like they couldn't identify with the label that they wanted to. So when it came to strategies used during disclosure, so this specifically pertains to when they're asked to disclose a race and they aren't able to disclose it using the label that they would like. And so, maybe they want to identify as multiracial and they're not given the option to do so. Then they can't select multiple options. So what do they end up doing? So there are multiple strategies that they end up employing. So they end up self-defining using the option other that we just talked about. They settle for the broadest term, like Asian. They reappraise the whole process as meaningless, kind of like building up a wall and being like, this is a meaningless process, and it doesn't matter. Or they reject disclosure. They end up not doing anything at all, not filling out that part of the form and rejecting it. So some examples here, again, this person talks about I usually opt for the label other when no other option is included. But more often than not, this lack of inclusion results in me skipping the question altogether if the question is optional. Other person talks about how they simply say mixed because they are, and they would rather just remain ambiguous than having to explain exactly what it is. Again, this person reappraised this process as meaningless. This experience has been a matter of fact, nothing more, nothing less. But then they went on about what would happen if they did have the option to disclose their race. So I just want to pause here for a second and really talk about what this means. So what it means when people are choosing other instead of having to identify with a more specific label or label that's provided, or when people reject disclosure altogether, like when they skip the question altogether, that's really problematic for organizations. Because organizations, if you remember in the beginning when I was talking about the tension, they're really doing this because they want to collect this data for workforce planning. They want to make sure that the demographic data distribution is equal, that they know where hiring should go next, that the promotion is fair and equitable, and all of those kind of things. But when the forms itself are designed in a way that people are forced to choose options like other, and they're or like not fill out the form altogether, they're not getting that information. So we're missing out on that very key data that's actually needed to make those forms valid and reliable, and organizations may not actually be able to achieve the results that they want. And I'm saying organizations in a broad way. It doesn't mean like a big corporation or company. It means universities as well. It means anyone who's using these disclosure forms and setting these up in a way without doing the due diligence, without making sure that it's inclusive, without making sure it caters to the demographic data of the people that they're giving the form out to. Okay, so when it came to white people, most of them did not feel like they were ever in a situation where they they didn't have the option to disclose as white. But for some people who did feel a dissonance sometimes, these ended up saying that they select broad terms to avoid uncertainty. And so this was people who wanted to combine their white category with their immigrant identity. So say they wanted to say white Canadian or white British. The other strategy was like they went with the clear majority label. So some examples of what we saw in our data was, this person talks about how they are described as white British, but they do not recall a time where this option was not provided to them. They can say that there always seems to be options for white Irish, Welsh, Scottish, but never white English, and this bothered them in the past, but now they don't care. So this was one example of someone who identified as white but still experienced some dissonance. This other person talks about how they think they're represented by the white or Caucasian label, but in a very loose and general sense. And in their view, that is only one very small aspect of who they are. And so they went with the label because they kind of think they identify with it, but they, again, don't feel like it's a necessary part. It doesn't really bother them. So, and so having understood how people feel about disclosure, which is clearly for non-white individuals, they're feeling this exclusion, this alienation, and they're having to incorporate these strategies to really figure out how to be true to themselves, identify themselves in ways that is true to them, but also sometimes fill out these forms. Sometimes these forms are not optional for them and they have to pick something. White individuals, on the other hand, are neutral about it. They aren't particularly very affected by the process. They aren't really feeling this dissonance. But for some individuals that do want to be more specific than white, they do report saying that they don't feel particularly passionately about it. They're okay about it. They haven't felt like a big like that they don't want to disclose that they ever have to select anything other than white. So we really wanted to understand, so what would they change? So we understand that there's a problem here. There's a mismatch. There is a potential mismatch between labels. Non-white individuals are suffering a little bit. So what can organizations do different? What would both white and non-white individuals like to see? And what was really great in our data was that despite their different experiences, white and non-white individuals actually agreed on what the recommendations for organizations were. And they were around two themes. So one was around changing the labels themselves. So what I mean by that is these are some of the suggestions they had, and in the order that they were the most popular to the least popular in our data. And what people wanted to see the most was that they wanted to see an option to that allows them to self-describe through open text responses instead of providing a list of options. So instead of limiting them to 4 or 5 options, having an option where they're allowed to self-describe, where they're allowed to type in their identities or write in their identities, so they control. Again, going back to that concept of identity autonomy, where people feel like they have the agency to claim the demographic categories they want. They are free to be who they are. This was the most popular theme that came up, that they wanted to be able to self-describe themselves in those forms. Second recommendation was around actually consulting with minorities to choose the best labels. So really talking to people in your organization, really taking a stock of the demographic identities in your organization, and really co-designing those forms or forming a committee or something like that is what they recommended, like really involving the minorities to make sure that the labels that are being chosen are a good fit for the organization, or really cater to the needs of the organization, the demographics of the organization. The third was around expanding a range of options provided. So a lot of organizations had 4 or 5 or 6 options, but as we can see, as I showed you that form in the beginning that had like 20 options, really expanding the range of options provided so people have a little bit more flexibility in how they want to self-identify themselves. The second theme of recommendations was really around changing the structure or the process itself. So beyond just changing the labels, they wanted to see other format type changes. So the most popular in that theme was really allowing people to choose multiple labels at once. So a lot of forms do that, but a lot of forms still don't do that. So this should be very basic, but allowing people to select more than one race at a time. Then increasing acceptance and respect for different ethnicities while deciding on labels. So again, this goes hand in hand with consulting with minorities, really taking a stock of what are the labels that you are using. Are the labels appropriate? Are the labels negatively stereotyped? Are they laden with some kind of negative connotations? Making sure that the labels that you're using are appropriate and inclusive for use. And the third, while less practical, recommendation was doing away with racial labels during disclosure altogether. Again, there was a lot of data. So like, what are the key takeaways that I wanted to really drive home with what we see in this qualitative sample? Racial minorities are more affected by the disclosure process, both through the labels that are being used in the form and how the forms are structured. Non-white employees actually feel excluded and alienated by current racial labels. And they feel this loss of identity autonomy when they see that the labels that they want, the categories that they want to claim are not included, but others are, or when they're forced to group themselves in a broader label that they necessarily don't identify with. White individuals are largely unaffected by this whole disclosure process and don't necessarily feel the dissonance that non-white individuals do. So there's this gap between non-white and white individuals and the experiences that they're having. And so minorities seem to be struggling with wanting to be specific, wanting to say a little bit more about their identity, like have a more specific, they want to be more specific. but they don't have the option to do so. And then when they don't, they're usually trying to find ways to regain their identity, autonomy, and legitimacy by, for example, using the label other, or dismissing disclosure altogether. That is another form in which people are actually trying to regain their autonomy by like not doing the normative thing. I'm not going to fill out this disclosure form. And like I said, this can actually backfire because because organizations, if they don't rethink and restructure their data collection process, this reduces the reliability and validity of the data. And so these forms then are not actually doing what they're supposed to do. And in doing so, they might be having negative consequence for employees, where they're like where they're using stereotype laden labels, and employees are feeling more stigmatized at the workplace, where employees are feeling more alienated because they feel like their identities are not as valued as someone else's. So collecting this demographic data can be a meaningful exercise for organizations that are looking to advance DEI in their workplace. However, this only can happen if the forms that are used to collect these data elicit authentic, valid, and reliable responses from employees. And that can only happen when individuals incorporate some of these recommendations that individuals in our sample had, when they're able to select multiple races at once, when they're able to type in their responses as well, when they're maybe more involved in the disclosure process. So a way to do that is basically giving back some of the power of self-defining back to the employees. So when they're actually doing the demographic form, having them regain their identity, autonomy, and legitimacy, having them have more of a say through all of these processes can actually be helpful. Thank you so much for your time, for listening. I have so much more to say, but I'm very interested in also hearing what you have to say and answering any questions you may have. Yeah, I'm gonna open it up for question and answers now.
Well, thank you very much, Grusha. That was an excellent presentation. And as Grusha said, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, feel free to either put them in the chat, or since this is a small group, you are always welcome to put on your video and you can ask a question, okay? So let's see. Yeah. So Corinne Louison said, excellent presentation. Thank you, Corinne. And Tan had said initially, whoa, definitely sounds like me. Skipping those optional boxes not given my option. Though I didn't realize the forums then became counterintuitive for the organization.
Yeah. It's interesting because sometimes when I present this, organizations push back and say, you know, but we need to have, you know, boxes. Because if there's open text response where you give them the freedom to write anything, it's hard for them to aggregate that information and actually in a palatable way that can be used. So one thing that I always tell them is that it doesn't have to be an either or thing. I think from our data, what it really shows is that people aren't really opposed to selecting it if they feel like they have that control, a little bit more control over the process. So if you start the form with like an open text response and give them the option to self-define, and then do the whole, you know, select a race thing, people are still going to be much more happy because they feel like they got to say their piece, and now they have to do their you know, checking the box thing, so organizations can actually help.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
So we will just give you another minute. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and you can ask a question.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was the main thing. I think organizations don't even realize that they're like affecting racial minorities. And a big step is like they just need to rethink and they need to keep updating, because one thing we realize in this ever-changing world that we live in, labels become outdated very quickly too. So I imagine we're gonna like design a form now, but in probably like 5, 6, 10 years, that those labels are gonna have probably be problematic, and you need to keep updating, you need to keep checking, and you need to make sure they're inclusive. Yeah.
Okay, so if there aren't any more questions or comments, on behalf of Vaughan Public Libraries, Grusha, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight. And I want to thank all of you who came out for taking the time to participate in this lecture. The lecture is going to be recorded and it is going to be on the VPL website soon. Our next theme is going to be on LGBTQI too, and that is going to close out our session on labeling. So thank you once again, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.